Okay. Welcome, everybody, and thanks for joining us. My name is Bernard Prusak, and I'm a professor of philosophy and the director of the Mackaman Center for Ethics and Social Responsibility at King's College. King's is a relatively small Catholic liberal arts college in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. If you don't know where that is, it's more or less the northeastern corner of the state. Great state of Pennsylvania, and we actually have, I think, nearly all of our election results this year. So this is our 2022 post-election day symposium, not quite post-elections, but post-election day symposium. And this year, we're doing something a little bit different. We're seeking some historical perspective on the politics of our time. Thank you to our presenters, and thanks to everybody for joining us this evening. Let me do bios, and this will be in order of presentation. Dr. Lydia Moland is professor of philosophy at Colby College in Maine, where she teaches courses on moral philosophy, aesthetics, and the history of modern philosophy. For most of her career, she wrote on 19th century German philosophy, including 2 books on the formidable philosopher G.W.F. Hegel, and here is one of those books. In 2017, she turned her attention to her own country, the United States, and to the 19th century abolitionist Lydia Maria Child, whose philosophical thinking and moral courage made her one of the most important voices among white Americans fighting to end slavery. Lydia's biography of Child, entitled Lydia Maria Child, A Radical American Life, we're talking too about how beautiful the book is, was published by the University of Chicago Press just a little while ago, about a month ago or so, in fall 2020, and it's already been reviewed in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Review of Books. Lydia also recently spoke, I just learned, on a food podcast. Podcast, is that right?
Yeah.
Among many other appearances. So thank you very much for joining us. Julie Schumacher Cohen is Assistant Vice President for Community Engagement and Government Affairs at the University of Scranton, where she focuses on community-based learning, political dialogue, refugee solidarity, and other civic engagement initiatives. Prior to position at Scranton, she worked for a variety of nonprofit organizations, including Churches for Middle East Peace and Citizens Union Foundation. She earned a master's degree in public administration from Villanova University and is pursuing, in her vast free time, a PhD in political science at Temple University. It's quite extraordinary that you're doing that on top of all your responsibilities at Scranton. Dr. Tom Mackaman is Associate Professor of History at King's. His research is focused on labor and immigration history, and he's the author of the book, New Immigrants and the Radicalization of American Labor, 1914 to 1924. At King's, as he remarked, you might regret this comment, he teaches across all American history, so he's going to be our go-to person for all kinds of questions. Tom also co-edited the volume, The New York Times 1619 Project and the Racialist Falsification of History, which was published in March 2021, and which he discussed with us last winter. And the recording of that event, by the way, has been viewed more times than any other event I've hosted the last 3 academic years. Last but not least, Hannah Maruhnich is class of 2023, so she's a senior, will graduate in May. She's a secondary history education major, and I learned she'll be doing her student teaching next semester, so good luck with that. Thank you for joining us. A little bit nuts and bolts. So Lydia will present first to talk about her book. She'll talk about parallels with the present day. She'll talk about what perspective the politics of Lydia Maria Child's time might give us on our own politics. Julie will then speak next, comment on the book, comment on contemporary politics, and also have a question or maybe 2 for Lydia. Tom will follow, do the same, and then finally Hannah. After that, we'll turn to Q&A, and that's open to everybody. Please send questions through the chat, bottom there of your Zoom screen, to me, Bernard Prusak, and I'll do my best to introduce those questions to our discussion. All right, I think we're ready to go. So, Lydia, thanks again.
Thank you. It's such an honor and privilege to be here. And thank you especially to the three commentators who are joining us this evening. I'm really honored that you're willing to take some time to look at my work and read about Lydia Mariah Child. And thank you especially to Bernard Prusak for the invitation. I'm really, as I say, honored to join this wonderful tradition of events through your McGowan Center for Ethics and Social Responsibility. So I want to start by just giving a little bit of background about who Lydia Mariah Child was, and then I want to talk about her attitude towards politics in general and elections in particular, and then talk fairly briefly about two elections that she commented on in particular, namely the election of 1856 and the election of 1864. So Child was born in 1802 in Medford, Massachusetts. Her father was a baker who had no real interest in educating his children, especially not his girls. But she developed an early and prodigious love of books and very quickly also became a prodigious writer. And so by the time she was in her mid-20s, she was already, I think, close to being the 19th century equivalent of a household name, which was extraordinary for a female author. She had written a couple of novels, several very successful children's stories. She was editing one of the first periodicals for children in the United States called The Juvenile Miscellany. And in 1829, she wrote a book called The Frugal Housewife, dedicated to those who are not ashamed of economy. And this was a kind of one of the United States' first cookbooks. It also had a lot of house cleaning tips about how to get rid of bed bugs or cure dysentery. And so she was really turned to as a beloved and trusted author who could give good advice and tell good stories. But in 1830, she met a man named William Lloyd Garrison, who was one of the was essentially founding the white abolitionist movement. So the foundation of abolitionism had been laid in Black communities across the country, including in Boston, where people like Mariah Stewart and David Walker were very active, along with others, who helped Garrison get his start publishing his famous newspaper, The Liberator. And then Garrison set about looking for white allies. And he knew who Child was, that she was famous enough that he knew who she was. And he thought she could make a good convert to the cause because of the kind of following that she had and the kind of trust that Northerners especially had in her. And it worked. He introduced himself to her. He made the arguments to her about for the abolition of slavery. I think it's really important for us to realize that in 1830, to be an abolitionist was to be a radical. So abolitionism specifically referred to the commitment to the immediate end of slavery, not gradual end, and also the end of slavery without compensation to enslavers. And so most white Northerners, some white Northerners were just in favor of slavery, and some were sort of uncomfortable with it, maybe wished it would go away, but were doing nothing to oppose it and had all kinds of justifications for it, from political leaders who argued that the United States might not survive another argument about slavery, or economic leaders who argued that the North's economy was dependent on Southern imports and that Northerners were invested in slavery economically in many ways. So to convert to abolitionism for Child was really to go against religious leaders, economic leaders, political leaders. But it happened. She felt like she could not live her life the same way again. She decided to devote herself to trying to eradicate slavery. And so the question became, what did she have that she could sacrifice to the abolitionist cause? And the answer, she decided, was her reputation as a trusted and beloved author. So she spent the next 3 years researching and writing a book that she published in 1833 called An Appeal in Favor of That Class of Americans Called Africans. And this was a kind of fire hose of arguments denouncing slavery. There was a chapter on the history of slavery, a chapter on the politics of slavery, on the economics of slavery. Of course, all of these were fields that women weren't really supposed to engage in anyway, but she went straight at it. And then in the last chapter of that book, she turns her attention to her own hometown, essentially. And the first sentence of that chapter goes something like, while we bestow our earnest disapprobation on the people of the South, let us not flatter ourselves that we are any better than they. And then she made the argument that Northerners were economically complicit in slavery, politically complicit in slavery, and also that Northern prejudice was necessary for sustaining slavery. So she talks about witnessing white people not allowing Black people into their churches, into their schools, into their places of work, into the stagecoach, into the hotels, and says very clearly to her fellow Northerners, Southern slavery would not continue unless it was upheld by this kind of racial prejudice. So as you can imagine, this is not what white Northerners wanted to hear from her. They were used to getting advice about, roasting their turkey, but they were not interested in being told that they were complicit in slavery. And she was, I think, the 19th century equivalent of canceled. Her book sales sputtered. She had to give up the juvenile miscellany. She was ostracized from polite society in Boston. And she spent really the rest of her life until she died in 1880, sort of on the fringe, ostracized, still fighting for racial equality, even after the end of the Civil War. So she was very clear that the end of slavery did not finish the job, that there was still massive racial inequalities and injustice that needed to be addressed. So she was incredibly prolific all the way through, publishing in a whole variety of genres, always with an interest to helping her fellow white Americans confront their racial prejudice. I'll say one more thing in introduction, and that is that while very few people have heard of her, almost everyone can recite something she wrote, and that is, over the river and through the wood, to grandmother's house we go. So the fact that she wrote that poem in the 1840s, the fact that she's known, if at all, for that sentimental evocation of American nostalgia, and not for her half century of blistering arguments against racial injustice in this country. The irony of that would not have been lost on her. So all of that as background, and now a little bit about her attitude towards politics. So to study the abolitionist movement in the 19th century is really to confront a range of arguments about whether progress happens through morality or through politics. And Child very clearly belonged to a camp of abolitionists that believed that it had to be moral transformation, that politics was essentially a dirty business. Some people like William Lloyd Garrison refused to vote because they thought that politics was an exercise of force. And as Christians, in Garrison's case, believed that Jesus had said never to use force. So there were some abolitionists who didn't vote at all and wouldn't participate in politics at all. Child was originally among them. So she said early on that if she had been allowed to vote, she wouldn't have, because she didn't believe that was the right way to affect change. And that was an issue over which the abolitionist movement split more than once. So there were abolitionists who later decided to found political parties based on abolitionism, or who decided to try to address slavery through the political system. And oftentimes that caused terrible dissension among abolitionists, and in some cases really split it. One very famous instance being Frederick Douglass deciding that he wanted to support the political fight against slavery, and William Lloyd Garrison breaking with him over that. So one of the first quotes that I'll read to you of Child's is where she says something to the effect of, ever since I can remember, the country was just about to be saved by a presidential election. And every time, salvation has proved to be farther and farther removed. So she clearly thought that unless Americans change their hearts and change their moral orientation around the idea of slavery, politics would just mean that the problem would reassert itself in another form later. So the moral transformation had to come first. But then I want to again talk to you and I'm going to read just a couple of paragraphs from two different sections of the book where I talk about these two elections. And the first one, the election of 1856, a very quick piece of context for that. That was a presidential election that happened around the time that there was real violence in Kansas over whether Kansas would be admitted as a free state or a slave state. So the city of Lawrence, Kansas had been sacked recently by pro-slavery forces who were trying to keep abolitionists out of the state in the hopes of admitting it as a slave state. So here's just a little bit of Child's attitude towards that election. The 1856 presidential candidates reflected a country in political turmoil. James Buchanan, a pro-slavery Democrat, was being opposed by candidates from two fledgling parties. The first was former President Millard Fillmore, now representing the anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, Know-Nothing Party. The second was a dashing young veteran, surveyor, and explorer named John Fremont. Fremont was a senator from the new and still mythical sounding state of California. He was the first presidential candidate to be put forward by a new political party called the Republicans. His hair was full and wavy, his wife was vibrant and beautiful, and he had literally struck gold on his California property. Most important, he was unapologetically anti-slavery. He had vowed, if elected, to aid the Kansas immigrants. Child admitted that she was smitten. For the first time in my life, I am a little infected with political excitement, she confessed to Mary and Lucy Osgood, her friends. For the sake of suffering Kansas and future freedom in peril, I do long to have Fremont elected. Don't you? Let's vote. The last sentence was, of course, a joke. The 19th Amendment, which finally permitted at least white women to vote, was 6 decades in the future. But for now, the still disenfranchised Maria Child focused on the progress that Fremont's candidacy represented. It could not be denied, she wrote to Sarah Shaw, that an abolition principle is the big wave which has taken Fremont on its back and is floating onward in the open light of day. We old abolitionists may well feel repaid for 25 years of labor, discouragement, unpopularity, and persecution, since our principles at last begin visibly to sway the masses. I, for one, thank God that I lived to see it. Her husband was still on a lecture circuit. Child threatened to dress in his clothes and vote for him if he was late. He arrived in time to vote and carry Child's father, a fragile 90-year-old, to the polls to cast his final ballot. My first vote was given for Washington, and my last shall be for Fremont, Child's father declared. Abolitionists everywhere held their breath. But when all the votes were counted, Buchanan had won. Neither the abolitionist arguments nor Fremont's charisma had been enough. The 90-year-old Converse Francis wept. His daughter was more philosophical. She had never really gotten her hopes up. She had thought too carefully and studied her fellow citizens' apathy and prejudice for too long to expect too much. That almost 1 million Americans had voted for the know-nothings, showing themselves more interested in ending immigration than ending slavery, was no surprise to her. But there was no denying that the election made things bleaker than ever. It assured the South of 4 more years of executive power, legislative advantage, and Supreme Court nominations. Our ship is sinking, my friend, she wrote to Parke Godwin. It is not reserved for the United States to be a beacon light for the world, as we have so proudly hoped. And then I want to fast forward very briefly to Abraham Lincoln's re-election. So when Lincoln was elected in 1860, people like Child had enormous hopes for him. He was clearly anti-slavery, and he seemed poised to make a real difference in the question of emancipation. And then Child was bitterly disappointed when Lincoln made very clear that he felt that his job was to preserve the Union, whether or not that meant preserving slavery. So if the Union could be preserved by eliminating slavery, that was fine with him. But if it had to be preserved by letting slavery continue, he would support that as well. Some of the angriest letters in Child's entire correspondence have to do with how angry she was at Lincoln for this. She just couldn't stand that someone with his kind of power was unable or unwilling to wield it in the cause of emancipation more quickly. So I want to read this brief passage about a moment during the war when Lincoln has to decide whether to allow Black men to join the Union Army. The press was full of dire predictions of what would happen if Lincoln allowed Black men to fight. Would there be mass defections in the Army ranks? Would this be the final straw that pushed the border states into the arms of their rebelling neighbors? The answer to both, Lincoln feared, seemed to be yes. So when Union General David Hunter enlisted former slaves in his regiment, Lincoln overruled him. When General John Phelps attempted to form fugitive slaves into regiments, he was told to use them for manual labor instead. Finding that this made him feel too much like a slave driver, Phelps resigned. In despair, Child turned again to her desk. In September 1862, she wrote a widely published letter, an open letter to her president. It may seem like a violation of propriety for a woman to address the chief magistrate of the nation at a crisis so momentous as this, Child began. Violation or not, Child spent several paragraphs discussing wartime policy, then rounded on Lincoln with indignation and shame. Shall I tell you, she said to her president, what I said when cold water was thrown on the spark of enthusiasm kindled by the brave, large-hearted General Hunter? Yes, she would tell him. Oh, what a misfortune it is to have an extinguisher instead of a Drummond light in our watchtower when the ship of state is reeling under such violent storm in the midst of sunken rocks. How, she demanded, could Lincoln justify overruling his generals when they had right on their side? It's fair to say that Child knew little of the bigger game Lincoln was playing as he tried to win a war and keep what remained of the country together, all while staying within what he thought was his legal power. She had always hated politics, so of course she hated the intricate political calculations Lincoln slowly played out as it seemed day by day that the possibility of emancipation receded. It would always be the job of reformers, as she sometimes put it, to hold politicians at the point of a moral bayonet, to be sure that they never forgot to consider what was right as well as what was legal. This letter is a case in point. If you can thus stifle the moral enthusiasm of noble souls, if you can thus disappoint the hopes of poor, helpless wretches who trust in you as the appointed agent of their deliverance, may God forgive you, Child concluded. It will, she predicted, require infinite mercy to do it. But Child came around to Lincoln by the time he was up for re-election. She came, I think, slowly to understand the longer game that he was playing. And while she still regretted that the Emancipation Proclamation, for instance, really lacked in moral conviction, it didn't have a lot of soaring rhetoric that would bring people to understand that the country had committed a sin, which was now being righted. She did feel like Lincoln had done what he should have done, and as she once put it, that he was a better president than the American people deserved. So at the end of that election, she wrote, I am a happy woman since the election. Lincoln has his faults, and I have sometimes been out of patience with him, but I will say of him that I have constantly gone on liking him better and better. So I'll essentially stop there. Those are just a couple of images of the kinds of distinctions that she tried to make between the moral and the political, and on the question of whether politics can save us and whether elections can save us if we have not transformed ourselves morally into desiring a more just world for morality's sake rather than just out of political expediency. So as we think about our most recent election and how we're all grappling with what it means and how to go forward with it, I think she would urge us to take whatever the results are and however we feel about those results just as a part of what we're called to do morally, and what she would be more interested in our being called to do is to think about our own moral lives and live those as best we can.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Bernard, for having us. And thank you, Lydia, for that wonderful introduction. And of course, the gift of the book. I had not known a lot about the life of Lydia Mariah Child. So it's really wonderful to get to know her through your work, and to just see the long arc of the abolitionist movement through her life. So I'm going to just pick up on a couple of the themes that you brought out, and then hopefully look forward to the discussion with the other respondents as well. I was reflecting over the weekend in reading the book about the election of Lincoln in 1860, and some of the struggles that we've had in recent years with our own elections. And I think a lot of positives that we've seen in the last kind of 24 hours is a lot of healthiness in our democracy, frankly, in that we've had a strong turnout among young people. We're seeing a process of candidates conceding their losses, which is more along the lines of our American tradition. And so I was thinking about the election in 1860, because of course that was such a contentious election, but Lincoln's opponents, who would obviously later secede, did accept the results of that. And I think, again, that's an American tradition that we've had and we want to preserve, and we will need to be patient, because as we know, the election results are not final, and they'll continue to be coming in over the next hours and days and weeks. But first I wanted to say a little bit about backlash politics. I think that in reading about her life and thinking and reflecting on, where we've been the last couple of years, and as we came to the election yesterday, it's been a pattern, I think, in American politics that often movements for racial justice often occur in the context of deep political polarization. And any progress that we make often prompts severe kind of counter reactions. And so in Child's life, we see many of her goals as an abolitionist come to fruition, in emancipation, but she's always witnessing different resurgences, retrenchment, the treatment of white abolitionists, many of her colleagues who come under threat, and of course, the racism and violence against Black Americans that continues during and after Reconstruction. As we heard, as you said, Lydia, the end of slavery did not bring equality as she had hoped. And I think in a similar way, we can think back over the last couple of years in the wake of the murder of George Floyd in the summer of 2020, and this racial reckoning, or so-called racial reckoning, that's come, in that time. We've also seen a retrenchment and a kind of backlash playing out, whether in state level anti-critical race theory legislation, the banning of books that seek to address issues of race and racism and telling a more honest story of our American history. Now at the Supreme Court, there's a case that may bring an end to affirmative action. We've seen really big shifts in political discourse around policing and police funding, from slogans like, quote, defunding to more fully funding. And so a lot of change there. And so I think this kind of backlash dynamic sends a message that racial equity is a low priority issue in American politics, or worse, maybe even an illegitimate one that doesn't win elections. And so it did make me think about, obviously, our topic tonight, about how Child thought about elections, and that she was deeply ambivalent, as you said, at many points in her life. And I think that's because of that gap between her radicalism and the pragmatism and realism that elections often embody. So she pushed for the right to vote. You mentioned that she said, she was pushing for the right to vote for Black Americans and for women, but then she said, I may not vote, even if I got the right, I might not do it, although she changed her mind. She was deeply disappointed when Andrew Jackson won in 1828. But ultimately, she was not politically disengaged. And I think that's important. I mean, she's engaged in so many ways in her life. I was very inspired by not only all of her political action, but also the small things that she would do, the sewing and the clothing. And, her life was fully embodied. She was political and personal. That's how strongly she felt, obviously. And also, as you mentioned, the re-election of 1864, she was reluctantly rejoiced in that, even as she remained very critical of him in different ways. And so that led me to my second point, which, as you kind of touched on already, and I think it's important to also highlight, is the continued lack of moral reckoning with racism and the legacy of slavery in this country. And so we see how she is continually concerned about the gains that are made against slavery lack a kind of moral rationale. They lack a sort of, attention to repair and reparation. And And this also reminded me of another contemporary person who's done a lot of good work in this area, Brian Stevenson, and the Equal Justice Initiative. And he has actually called for a truth and reconciliation process for the United States that would be akin to other societies. He gave an interview in summer 2020 where he said, I want to talk about this history of enslavement and of Native genocide and of lynching and segregation. Not because I'm interested in punishing America, I want to liberate us. And so I was recalling that as I was reading the book, because I think that's what she was hoping for. I think she didn't see it in her lifetime. And I think our politics has not been giving us the space, unfortunately, to be able to accomplish it now. And we'll see what happens as we move forward. But I wanted to read from the book a particular quote that really struck me. And this is your words. You're saying, "Child found the September Emancipation Proclamation deeply disappointing." She writes, and now I'm quoting her, "I was thankful for the president's proclamation, but by no means jubilant. I confess to having all along painfully felt a want of moral grandeur in the process of emancipation now going on. God is accomplishing a great work by the meanest tools." So I think we're still reaping the effects of those sort of meanest tools. Many political scientists have noted that efforts to keep the peace and decrease polarization in American politics have often been done at the expense of making further gains for racial justice, including during the civil rights movement era. And I think we could think about the last couple of years in that regard. Some historians have also argued that the Civil War, in a sense, has never really ended. We've had so many issues that were unresolved. And we have seen over the last few years a resurgence of white supremacy, in various ways, including at the January 6th insurrection. So I think Child, in a lot of ways, was asking in her time in the 1800s, whether we could reinvent ourselves and become a truly multiracial American democracy. And I think that we're still asking that today, in a sense, every time we all go out and cast our votes as neighbors in our community and in around the country. And then just briefly, I wanted to just note that I really appreciated how the book described the very deep differences that existed within the abolitionist movement, because I think we have a tendency sometimes to sort of romanticize social movements and think that they kind of went in one straight line. And we see the differences that she has with her about whether women's rights or the anti-slavery cause, which kind of should go first. She breaks with her white suffragists who have, racist views. And then, of course, all the disagreements about persuasion versus obviously the problematic idea of this uplift suasion, nonviolence, pacifism, non-resistance by her friend Garrison, or whether the use of force would be necessary. And so I just think you laid that out in a way that really helps us to understand what was going on. She has to endure the agony of being a quote, war-supporting pacifist during the Civil War. And so again, I think it's an important lesson for us as we think about what can make political and social change today and how we might see ourselves in that kind of continuum. So I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to just give you one to start off with. And one is that I wondered what you would think she would say of our political polarization today. How would she see it in relation to what she lived through? Obviously, the Civil War, which was a really low point beyond really even the sort of language we use today of polarization. But what might she see as the main cause today, and what might she see as the remedy?
Thank you for those extremely thoughtful and thorough comments. It's such a joy to hear you working through some of these same questions that I've lived with the last few years. And I agree with you that her life gives us the opportunity to ask so many of these questions that are so central to activism, many of which you just enumerated. I think if she, were to see us today, she wouldn't be surprised at all. She was very clear that if slavery only ended through violence, the hatred that had been engendered through slavery would just reappear in another form. And I think she, at a certain point, as you say, realized that the war was the only thing that was actually going to bring the end to slavery. But at the end of the war, sometimes people would say to her, aren't you glad that you lived long enough to see justice done to Black people? And she would say, if I do live long enough to see justice done to Black people, I'll be happy, but it hasn't happened yet. And I don't expect it to happen. So I think that sort of first and foremost, that she would not have been surprised that the Civil War delayed or just continued some of the problems that we've had. I think also what you identify as the problems within the abolitionist movement itself are still with us today. And this gives me the opportunity to say what I, feel very strongly about admitting, which is that she was very imperfect. And there are many things that she tried to do and did that now look terribly paternalistic or assimilationist or bullying even, and sometimes limited in the way she understood what Black people actually needed. So that was true across the abolitionist movement. Linda Hirschman has recently written a book that specifically talks about racist attitudes among abolitionists. And so I think that that's a good reminder to us that it was entirely possible for people in her generation to want slavery to end, but to have no commitment to the idea of racial equality. So maybe Black people shouldn't be enslaved, but that did not mean that most white Northerners wanted them in their churches or schools or et cetera. And so I think Child would also not be surprised that there is still real tension between, let's just say, white liberals and some of the most painful parts of anti-racist movements now. So I think both of those things would indicate that she still thinks that there is an enormous amount of racial reckoning that needs to happen. And she was definitely at the end of the war in favor of just redistribution of land that had been held by Confederates, by people who had betrayed their country, redistributing that to newly freed Black people, newly emancipated Black people. And I think that was one way that she thought, she didn't use the word reparations, but she did think that something like that was certainly owed to people who had been enslaved. Secondarily, was the only way that the country could get going on another footing and sort of get a kind of real repair going that could affect real change. So I have lots that I'd love to say about some of your other points, but I want to give the other folks a chance to either say something or jump in on those questions.
Thank you.
Thanks, Julie.
Well, thank you, Bernard, and thank you, Lydia, for joining us this evening. I'd like to begin my brief remarks with a note of praise for the book, then offer a historical comment, and finally leave Lydia with a question. I'd say that to me, the outstanding feature of the biography is that it brings back to consciousness this very fascinating figure, Lydia Mariah Child. I'll confess that even for someone such as myself, who reads a good deal of antebellum US history, Child's role in the abolitionist movement had been obscure. Suffice it to say that she doesn't usually make the short list of what we might call the abolitionist all-star team, which regularly includes names like David Walker, William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Wendell Phillips, Theodore Dwight Weld, and the sisters Grimke. But Professor Moland establishes that Child was an abolitionist of the first rank who commanded a national audience and who, like the others, suffered for her cause. She also shows that Child was a figure of considerable talent, perhaps even brilliance, worthy of study in her own right as an intellectual and cultural figure, and as a woman who fought for a public career against a society whose highest ideal for women was just the opposite. This biography is therefore an act of historical recovery, and for that, Professor Moland deserves our praise and her book its audience. What's more, it brings new attention to the abolitionist movement. To say aloud the list of historical figures that I just mentioned, and to include Child's name on that list, is to be reminded that this movement's potency. Abolitionism drew together a cadre of brilliant, selfless, physically courageous, and far-sighted individuals. They were white and Black, men and women, and with heavy British involvement, even transatlantic. Surely one of the things that is most striking about the abolitionist movement was its extraordinary transformation from a small persecuted sect, as Professor Moland's book so well shows. And here I should mention in passing the near lynching of the abolitionist William Camp Gildersleeve on the streets of our own Wilkes-Barre in 1839. But what is striking is its transformation from a small, violently persecuted sect into a mass movement that ultimately witnessed the triumph of its overriding aim, the destruction of chattel slavery in America. And let me cite here Frederick Douglass's beautiful eulogy for William Lloyd Garrison, delivered in 1879. Garrison, Douglass said, moved not with the tide, but against it. He rose not by the power of the church or the state, but in bold and flexible and defiant opposition to the mighty power of both. It was the glory of this man that he could stand alone with the truth and calmly await the result. What Douglass said of Garrison, he might just as well have said of Child, of himself, and of the whole abolitionist movement. Standing seemingly alone in the 1830s in a country that upheld slavery by law, violence, and by a great deal of racist ideology, the abolitionists, in their main aim, again, the destruction of slavery, were vindicated by the Civil War, emancipation, and the 13th Amendment. But the way that this took place was predicted by no one. Opposition to slavery became the ideology that fused a new mass political party, the Republican Party, headed up by Abraham Lincoln. As Moland points out, though Lincoln was opposed to slavery, he was not an abolitionist. Yet the logic of events, and chiefly the Southern counter-revolution launched to defend slavery in 1861, pushed Lincoln in the direction of total emancipation, pushed him to the destruction of the slave owners as a class, and to lead what historians have long called the Second American Revolution. This brings me to the subject of tonight's discussion, elections. The Lincoln elections of 1860 and 1864, both of which have already been mentioned this evening, were undoubtedly the most important in American history. It was, in fact, Lincoln's victory in 1860 that triggered secession and Civil War. In an echo of contemporary politics, the slave-owning oligarchy let it be known that it would not accept the results of an election it did not win. And the form that took in 1861 was secession. It would not stay in a country with Lincoln as president. Then in 1864, it appeared that Lincoln might lose his re-election bid. Had the Democrat, former General George McClellan, won, it is a near certainty that the Emancipation Proclamation would have been reversed and that Southern independence would have been recognized. Lincoln's victory in 1864 ensured the completion of the abolitionist project. As we see in Professor Moland's biography, the relationship between the abolitionist movement and politics was vexing. Historians traditionally draw a distinction between abolitionism, which was uncompromising in its demand for complete abolition, and anti-slavery politics, which it was imagined in the time kept faith with the founding fathers by hewing to a program of containing slavery, which it was hoped in the North and feared in the South would lead to slavery's gradual extinction. Lincoln embodied that latter perspective, and Garrison was probably the purest distillation of the former. We can look from our vantage point in 2022 and see that the abolitionists were in fact correct. There could be no compromise with slavery. And yet ultimately and paradoxically, it was not moral suasion, but a mass political movement, the anti-slavery Republican Party, headed up by a popular leader, Lincoln, that waged a violent revolution against slavery. In my estimation, therefore, the distinction drawn between abolitionism and anti-slavery is somewhat arbitrary and difficult to teach, I might add. It might be better to imagine in the antebellum US a vast, multifaceted movement culture of which the abolitionists and figures like Child were the most conscious element, influencing a society that was thereby itself becoming more and more conscious of slavery as a problem. Again, as Professor Moland's book reminds us, the abolitionists and figures like Child played an indispensable role in this. For it was first of all necessary to see slavery as wrong before the wrong could be righted. That stage of historical development could not be bypassed. History prevents no problem for which it does not also present a solution, but the problem itself must first be consciously identified. Identifying the problem of slavery, of course, was one thing, ending it still another. As late as 1858, the Chicago Tribune could write that, quote, "No man living," unquote, would see slavery's end. But 7 years later, it was destroyed. Notwithstanding the subsequent betrayal of Reconstruction and the implementation of Jim Crow in the South, the achievement of slavery's end was indeed monumental. And to me, this raises the question of all questions in history. Why is it that things happen when they happen? Which in turn brings me to my question for Professor Moland. Why did abolitionism happen when it did? And to be more precise and specific to our discussion tonight, why and how did the times produce someone so remarkable as Lydia Mariah Child?
Thank you so much for those wonderful reflections and a wonderful and also essentially unanswerable question as far as I know. This is one of the questions that really motivated me to write the book. Again, Child was not perfect, and she said many things that we now take issue with, but she was so far-sighted in so many ways, not just on the topic of slavery, but others, that I just wonder what produced her, what allows some people like Child, but also like Garrison, and also people like David Walker and people like Frederick Douglass to be able to see and to be able to articulate something that moves a needle in a way that hadn't happened before. I think in Child's case in particular, it was some combination of her novelist sympathies. She loved novels, she loved fiction, she loved being able to imagine other people's lives. And then on the other hand, just a very keen commitment to a kind of integrity, whereby you would actually take American principles seriously and then try to live up to them and call yourself and others out when that didn't happen. And so I see her as a kind of thinker that, well, to back up for a second, often in moral philosophy, there's the question, what motivates change? Is it an appeal to sympathy, or is it an appeal to reason or to argumentation? And she was someone who could really do both, and I think was able to bring them into a kind of fusion that allowed her a kind of power to reach as many people as she could reach. I think there were definitely influences from the kind of Christianity that she and Garrison and Douglass and David Walker is another fantastic example of someone who used biblical texts and also political texts to call people to a kind of integrity. So as a Black man, he was writing from within a tradition, trying to call white Americans to follow their own principles. And other than that, I don't have a good answer. I think there was a kind of tipping point, a kind of energy that was built on the foundation of anti-slavery societies that had already been founded in Boston by Black Americans, and also in Philadelphia and in New York, that were just sort of simmering enough in the background, as it were, to start getting people's attention. And then there were other smaller things like the invention of a new kind of printing that allowed abolitionists to print tracts and other kinds of publications in numbers and in masses that could reach people much more quickly than they had. So again, I don't have a complete answer to that, but those are some of the factors that I think go into Child as an individual and then the abolitionist movement more generally.
Thank you, Tom. Hannah, please.
Hi, so first of all, thank you. I would like to thank everybody for giving me this wonderful opportunity to be able to be a part of this panel to begin with. I mean, being just, a student, secondary education history major, like it's really an honor for me to be here and to comment on your book. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to read your book. I think it was a great read, and I think you're a very talented writer. And I'm going to comment on something that people really haven't commented on, which is I enjoyed how you scattered pictures and newspaper articles throughout your book, because I think it helps readers and even people like who are reading this book and learning about it. It helps to connect like it connects people to the time period, and it helps people like, sorry, I'm like stuck in my chair right now because I've been sitting here for a while. So it helps people like connect to the time period, and it helps people who learn differently. Some people learn through pictures as well too. It helps people to learn about the time period differently instead of reading. So I really like that. And I also liked how you connected your philosophical knowledge to historical knowledge. And I think it's really nice that you took these two different backgrounds and put them together in one, and how you answered the philosophical questions that you put in your book in a historical manner. So that's what I really liked about this. And I do have two questions for you, which one of them is, one of the most striking things that one of the things that is so striking about the abolitionist movement is that so many of its prominent figures were women, like Child. So what was it about the abolitionist movement that nurtured its possibility? I will answer, if you want to answer that first one, then you could do that, and then I'll ask the second one.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you so much for those comments. I'm thrilled that you liked the images. I was so lucky that my publisher just did not stop me. I kept finding more images and they kept letting me put them in. So I will pass that on to them, so they'll know that that had a good effect. Yeah, as far as women go, I mean, I think part of it had to do with just how radical this group was in its inception. So they were so on the fringe of society generally, that they were kind of scrappy and iconoclastic, and this meant that they weren't worried about all kinds of social norms that other people were following. And so that gave women an in a way, because it wasn't an established movement with established leaders and an established social structure. And they were also, quite frankly, pretty desperate for help. And so when they found someone like Child who could write, or people like the Grimke sisters who could speak, they wanted all the talent that they could get. And so I think there was a kind of entrepreneurial spirit and an openness, and a kind of we're all radicals anyway, and nobody's going to agree with us anyway, so why not let the women do these things? And plus we need help. And they were so good at raising money and converting other people and talking to people in their sewing circles. And it really became a moment for women to start exploring other ways that they could participate in their own country's politics. And as you know, having read the book, and I'll just say for other folks watching, this became an enormous liability. I shouldn't say liability, it just became an enormous source of tension in the abolitionist movement as it became more mainstream and started bringing in more people who were used to the norms of the society, were very uncomfortable with women being as active as Child and her friends were. And that was another moment where there was a really radical split in the movement. So those are some of the reasons I think they got started early in the movement, and then of course had to deal with a lot of headwind later.
I really liked how you answered that. That really answered my question. So then my second question is about research. It's more pertaining to you versus the book. So how did you come to research Lydia Mariah Child? And were you interested in this topic prior to writing the book? Or like what caught your attention to the topic? Like what research went into it? And like how long did it take you to really come up with this entire book about her?
Yeah, another lovely question. Thank you. I had never heard of her as far as I knew. I could recite Over the River and Through the Wood, but that was about it. But I had this sense in the last several years, specifically after the 2016 election, that my country was in a kind of moral crisis. And I thought, I don't want to keep doing philosophy the way I had been doing it. No offense to Hegel, but I decided he could sort of take care of himself. And I just decided I wanted to turn to women and to my own country. And I went to the Schlesinger Library at the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard, and completely serendipitously discovered a letter from her. It was signed L. Mariah Child. At that point, I didn't even know that her first name was Lydia. And that letter spoke to me so directly and so passionately that I immediately wanted to know more about her. Not all books are like this, but this book for me really was just, once I knew who she was, I essentially never stopped. I just immediately felt like I wanted to devote the next project energies that I had to her. And I think I originally thought that it would be a more philosophical book. But a friend said to me something like, no, I think you have a much bigger story here. I think you should just tell her life. And the more I wrote, the more her life took over. And so, yeah, I started that research in early 2017. I was very lucky to have a leave from teaching that allowed me to make a lot of progress on the book. And then I just have absolutely every minute between anything devoted myself to trying to get the book out. So it was an immense joy to me. And I feel so fortunate that I discovered her in the moment that I was looking for someone just like her.
Great
Thank
questions.
you. I
Hannah.
really appreciate that.
Great
Thank you.
questions.
Thank you all
Thank
for
you.
the great questions. Yeah.
And I think our panelists have some more questions as well. So at some point, for example, Julie, I know you have another question. At some point, feel free. We have some great questions, though, too, from the chat. So I'm going to do my best here. I want to begin with this one, since it's an early point that you made, Lydia, and it's a point, too, that Tom picked up. So you noted, Lydia, that she's really not known for her radical abolitionism. She's known for that little ditty poem. As Tom put it, she's not on the abolitionist all-star team. I wonder if you talk a little bit about that. So why do you think she's been, I'll say largely forgotten, certainly not forgotten by historians, by other writers, but not somebody who is well known, let's say like Frederick Douglass or William Lloyd Garrison.
Yes, thank you. So I should say that there in the 1990s, there were two wonderful biographies written of her, one by Deborah Clifford and one by Carolyn Karcher. And those are real feats of scholarship. These were women researchers taking on someone who was essentially at that point neglected and doing the very hard pre-internet research of unearthing who she was and bringing her to a scholarly audience anyway. But as to why she had been so quickly forgotten, I think there are a couple of reasons. One, I think, is just clearly gender. She was never going to be as much of a name as the male abolitionists, in part because people were still uncomfortable with a female activist and someone who was so stridently working in male-dominated fields like economics and history. And I think a kind of general discomfort with a woman who was that out of the norm. I think we can never discount that kind of gender bias. I also think that I know she did because she said it, she was profoundly uncomfortable with what she called lion hunting. She did not like to be lionized. She did not think that the cause of racial justice was best served by treating people like heroes. And so there were sometimes efforts to anthologize her works or write a biography of her. And she often pretty decidedly resisted them. She didn't want to be in the great pantheon. She didn't want to be treated like Garrison. So like one quick example would be that when Garrison died, 1,500 people came to his funeral, flags flew at half-mast all across the country. When Child died, her friends discovered that she had left brutally Spartan directives for her funeral. She didn't even want flowers. She didn't want anyone there. She didn't want to be written up in the newspaper. She just wanted to go away and be reborn in a higher spiritual realm. And so I think in part her becoming more forgotten was because she didn't feel comfortable with being a hero. And you might therefore start wondering whether I should even have written this book, and I have tried very hard to portray her as a full human and not just as a hero. I do a lot of thinking through the book about things that I think she got wrong and things that I have learned about making sure that I don't repeat some of those mistakes myself. But I do think she resisted that kind of adulation that is always too tempting for us to give people that we want to put on a pedestal. And I think one other quick thing, I think she felt genuinely conflicted about whether she had achieved what she wanted to achieve in her life, because she saw Reconstruction fail so badly, and the violence against Black people, especially in the South, surfaced with such vicious thoroughness that I think she, even though emancipation had been accomplished, she felt like that was only part of what she had fought so hard to achieve. And the part that would have sustained that kind of moral change, she felt like she had not achieved.
Let me ask a quick question about politics. There are a few of those questions. So, but this one I'm not going to read in full, so apologies to the question asker, but there's a lot of good material here. So the question has to do with how Child thought the country could be changed without the use of politics. Now, maybe she changed her own thinking on that question. So, is that possible? So she hoped for something of a reinvention of ourselves. Can that be done without lobbying and rallies and voting? If it, like, how else, according to this question, could it be done without doing such things?
Yeah, good question. So again, she wasn't as explicit as Garrison was. And in fact, I know she didn't agree with Garrison that voting was in and of itself wrong, because it enshrined a human government where there should only be, our relationship with God. She did not think that Garrison was right about that. She wasn't as extreme as Garrison was on that question. So I think what she would have said is that if humans change their hearts, if people are willing to let go of their racial prejudices and see that they were evil and have done immense harm, then out of that will grow initiatives to change laws and to rewrite constitutions. And that if it comes from a groundswell of people convicted that they were part of the problem and that they need to change, then that will percolate through the democratic process, as it were. And if it instead is forced on people by a certain group who's decided that people need to change their behavior before they've changed their hearts, that will just never be as effective. So I think it was in part a matter of order, like what had to happen first. But I do think she thought that there was a way that could function in a democracy such that the laws and then the Constitution would change.
I wonder if we can follow up on that. And maybe Julie and Tom, you could enter here, since you both spoke in some ways to that question. Tom, you made the point that it was really through this anti-slavery politics, right, that abolitionism's goal was accomplished. And Julie, you made a really interesting comment that maybe we're still living with the effects of using the meanest terms to redress racial injustice. So it wasn't first and foremost through moral transformation that this occurred. Perhaps moral transformation has yet to occur deeply in any event on this question. Anyhow, I wonder if you two could enter the conversation there, since you seem to be speaking to some of the same themes. And the question, I suppose, and to simplify, is how much. Well, no, I'm not going to simplify it. I'm going to leave it there.
Well, let me. I think we've kind of mentioned how she, had her ambivalence toward sort of formal politics in different ways, but I think she really, prior to my work at Scranton, and even some of the work I do at Scranton, relates to sort of, the word we use now when we're citizens and we do advocacy, or we work at institutions and we lobby our public officials. And she was doing that all the time. I mean, she was a public advocate. So she didn't run for public office. Obviously she couldn't have, That was not an opportunity for her. But I was thinking, especially when with this question, the exchange of letters that she has with Virginia Governor Henry Wise, and this idea of sort of calling in and calling out. And that's very present in our politics now, because she writes to him privately first, if people haven't read the book, because of John Brown is in prison. He's committed violence, and he's been in prison, and she wants to go down and visit him. And so she calls and requests that she not calls, she writes him a letter, the governor, to see if she can come and visit Brown. And he basically gets mad at her kind of, and writes this letter back, but releases it to the press. And it's, first of all, it's so interesting in the sense that this is the 1800s. Here we have, we're used to our communication on Twitter and social media, but I found it fascinating how they're going back and forth. And you, obviously, Lydia, you did that really well in terms of showing that to us. And then that also prompts this further exchange of letters with Mrs. Mason and all of that. But that is doing a huge amount of work in terms of, all of her writing is, but I thought that what in particular is an example of how she's also writing to other officials at different points. So she's a public advocate. She does believe in politics, even if she doesn't always, say it or sort of, express it in the same way as we might now. But she's very much engaged, I think.
To Julie's last point, I think part of it comes down to definitions. I think we would define now what even the moral suasion wing of the abolitionist movement was doing is very political. But they were speaking the the idiom of the time, and this was a country that had been swept by the Second Great Awakening, and this iteration of religiosity took on this aspect of cleansing society of its sins. And slavery became identified in this way. Now, just additionally, I think there's a kind of logic to the position that they took that emerged out of the real underlying problem of the American political system in the antebellum. Political scientists call this the second party system, and it's the Whigs and the Democrats. And really, the whole political structure was set up to suppress the slavery question, which nonetheless continued to emerge. There's this great quote from Jefferson already in 1820, where he identifies the Missouri crisis as and the resolution, which pushed it down as a reprieve only, and indeed it continued to return. Ironically, it was the very growth of the country that kept thrusting the slavery question back to the forefront. But the Whigs, as the lesser party, constantly worked hand in glove with the Democrats to suppress the slavery question. And so the point I'm trying to make is that abolitionists, there was a great deal of disgust with the political system, and they sought ways around it. Of course, it crashed and burned in the 1850s, and the inability of the political system to absorb the emergence of the Republican Party is really what led to the war. So anyway, just add those points to the discussion.
Thanks. We're going to go until 8:15, just in case people are wondering. And I've got another politics question. I think this is picking up on an observation you, Julie, might have made about polarization in our time. And the question simply was the polarization in her time, significantly different. So not only on what it was about, but as polarization from the polarization in our time. I'm reminded of this little column I read this morning. I won't say too much more, so it's not my question. But there's people can vote out of hope, but people can also vote out of fear. So you can vote out of fear that the other party is going to win, and that's what leads you to vote, as a so-called negative polarization. So anyway, I wonder if you could speak to that. How's the polarization in our time different from her time?
I think there's so many similarities, and Tom can probably answer that more fully. But when you think about like a couple of moments that really brought home to me as I was doing this research how polarized people were. One was the anti-abolitionist mobs in the 1830s, which were really just sort of extrajudicial violence against abolitionists, trying to shut them down so that they would not, so their speakers couldn't speak and they couldn't publish their newspapers because that was seen as such a threat. So really extreme violent polarization. The Kansas Nebraska Act unleashed this whole other wave of political violence in the 1850s that I referred to briefly. And yeah, there were battles then. There was also around that time also was when Charles Sumner was caned on the Senate floor. So there was a lot of really violent polarization. And we see a fair amount of that threat now as well. I hope not as much as at that time. But I guess the other thing that I'll just say briefly is that there's so many painful moments in Child's story where the polarization is also such that people won't speak to each other if there's any indication that they have any difference in tactics or beliefs, a kind of litmus test or the resolve not even to speak to people who have a different perspective than you do within the abolitionist movement, not just between abolitionists and non-abolitionists. But that feels really familiar to me too, that we get to a point where we can't even, where we feel defiled if we even have conversations with each other. Child really fought against that. When she was running the National Anti-Slavery Standard in the 1840s, she tried so hard to make it a paper that allowed people with different tactics and different approaches to ending slavery to converse with each other. And she was essentially driven out of the movement for that, for being too moderate. So some of her more radical Garrisonian allies didn't like that she was willing to talk to people who differed with her on tactics or whatever. And that just feels really resonant to me and familiar with some of the kind of polarization we have now. But perhaps other folks have more to say about that.
Well, I would just add that, I think there are similarities and also differences. I'm remembering when I was writing a paper for in my master's program, and I was taking a class with a foremost expert, William Allen, on the Federalist Papers. And I was kind of lamenting at the time, this was maybe 10 years ago, about the polarization in Congress. And he reminded me, well, we had the Civil War in America. And so sometimes when we think about our polarization today, we really don't recall the ways in which polarization led to, the great Civil War. At the same time, the concerns that we see today around polarization are when they're moving into this kind of what some political scientists call affective polarization, where people are really, they don't want to spend time together. They don't want to date or marry people from another political party. They don't, it's moving into your social life in a way that goes far beyond just differences in political issues. And there can be good reason for that. But the further it goes that way, the further you worry about sort of dehumanization and obviously more political violence. So I think we do have concern I think we should be concerned around our political polarization today, even if absolutely it was still more severe in Child's time.
Tom, did you want to comment? Don't feel obliged.
Yeah, I'll just try to be really quick. I agree very much with what Lydia said, and I think she one of the considerable strengths of the book is its treatment of the violence that surrounded American politics, and the abolitionists were a lightning rod for this. The point I made before, that the political system couldn't address the slavery question, so it really kind of fell apart. And I think to ask that question of present, what are the questions that the American political system as a whole is not addressing? And I think there would be that could actually be quite a long list. But I'll just make one other point. The Know Nothing Party came up for discussion, and I would say that I think Eric Foner writes well on this in his book, Free Labor, Free Soil, and Free Men. The emergence of the know-nothings was really kind of a distraction to divert attention from slavery. And I think that anti-immigrant politics has again and again played that role in American history. It's kind of a toxic diversion, as I view it historically.
I'm sorry, I'm going to, Julie, I do want you to ask your question. Then Hannah, I'm going to give you the last question if you'd like. And it's 8:15, but bear with me for just a second. There was another question in the chat. I didn't think we'd be able to address it, but maybe just quickly, since Tom spoke about immigration. So, tension emerged between newly emancipated slaves and new immigrants from Europe. Did Child express sympathy one way or the other? Did she try to stay out of politics around immigration?
She did worry about immigration in ways that sometimes sound, I wouldn't quite say anti-immigrant, but she would sometimes say things like, how are we going to absorb this many people who don't understand our democracy and don't understand, in many cases aren't literate and et cetera. But she was very faithful at deploring any kind of demonization of immigrants, including at the end of her life, Chinese immigrants, and really fought to keep people from demonizing them in any sort of way that would feed into the more, the more racist tendencies, but also, as Tom says, the way in which immigration can also be a distraction, often from other kinds of problems. So yeah, she was very aware of those issues arising and tried always to call people to a non-racist reckoning with what were, as she saw it, challenges of immigration for sure.
Julie, did you want to ask your other question?
My other question's on a totally different tack. I just, so it could be a brief answer, but as she ends, as her life is ending, I was so struck by how she just eschews any, her frugality in her later years. She doesn't even want to go to some of her friends' houses anymore. She gets sort of tired of their big parties. And she really reminded me of the Catholic radical Dorothy Day in those moments. But of course, she never really, joins any religion. I mean, she's very ambivalent also about religious joining. And so I just kind of wondered what you see. I don't think she was mimicking anybody in it, but I don't know if that would be a comparison that would make any sense. But at least it reminded me of Dorothy in Child's later years.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And yeah, it was a vexed topic for her. She deeply believed in a spiritual afterlife and that we were living in a valley of shadows and couldn't see things for what they were, and that death would allow us to transcend those boundaries and be united with each other in a more perfect way. And so I think towards the end of her life, she'd been frugal her whole life since she wrote The Frugal Housewife. She was like, she had to be. But that became for her a kind of way of preparing for shedding her mortal body and ascending to an afterlife where, as I sometimes joke, no quiet quitter was Lydia Mariah Child. She wanted to keep working. So at a certain point towards the end of her life, she says, I'm looking forward to getting rid of my body because I think I have more work to do in the universe. So there was a sense that the body was not, that frugality would also allow her to pay more attention to her spiritual essence, which death would allow her to come closer to achieving.
Perhaps an unfortunate Socratic moment there, Lydia. Hannah, do you have a final question? It'd be great if you did.
I really don't. I've just been sitting here listening to everything, and I think everything was answered very well. So I really don't.
Well, we'll leave it at that. So thank you very much. Thank you, Hannah, for your earlier great questions. Thank you, Julie and Tom, for your comments and for your questions. Lydia, thanks for the presentation and sharing this work with us and raising, really interesting questions about how we think about our own politics today and our involvement in it. So thanks everybody for joining us to the very end. I'll stop there. Good night, everybody.